Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see everybody. And it's such a privilege to be here with Nancy and the ECIS and ISL team to do the loft. And I can imagine, like myself, you are feeling that things are moving so fast. Every time I work with AI, I suddenly realize that I'm in catch-up mode. And now that there are a lot of new things coming out in the last 6 months, we have AI agents. These are basically AIs that you install in your computer and they do tasks for you. They fill up forms, they build websites for you on a prompt. We have also a political situation where deregulation and the AI policies are going to be loosened up. And it's very much, if you think of North America now, we have going to have a culture where these big tech companies are going to be empowered to have a lot of say on our day-to-day lives. And with this comes a whole complexity and nuances. And at the same time, in schools, we're navigating the realities of day-to-day mundane things that we have to do. Not that they're mundane, but they're complicated. And we have kids and we have emotions and we have report cards and assessments, and it goes on and on. And layered on top of this is this acceleration that's kind of unfettered. There are very, very few things stopping it apart from what the companies can't afford or what they can't build. But as we see, there's a lot of investment and a lot of things happening so fast that I think there's no better opportunity than to start thinking about this in the context of the book that Dee and Ken, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, The Promise and Perils of AI in Education. I've had the privilege and honor of working with Ken, and he's been a guest on our podcast. So it's just so nice to have you back here. Ken is an esteemed member of the educational technology community. He is a distinguished Apple Distinguished Educator, Google Certified Innovator, and he has actually won an award for making IT happen, and also the Professional Learning Digital Equity Learning Network Excellence Award. And he is a writer, he presents, he does a lot of work with schools all over the world. And what I love about Ken, he always centers it on the importance of ethics. And how important is that? Because sometimes we get so caught up in stuff, we forget about the ethics, and that's going to be so important. And the co-author is Dee Lanier, who is an educational tech leader, and he leads education experience designer at Lanier Learning. And he also has a long history of working in education technology, and he's a thought partner and speaker and author and coach that is inspiring many teachers around the world. And I do really encourage you to go to their social media and to the page that Nancy has set up to connect with them, because there's so much more than what we can cover today. So Dee and Ken, thank you so much for being here. And I think, this idea of the promise and perils of AI in education, but then at the bottom of the book, you say ethics, equity have entered into the chat. And I think this is really interesting that you bring this up, because I feel sometimes we are having a Faustian relationship with AI. We're so enamored and so excited, and it's easing us, and it's so easy to do. But what kind of inspired you to create this book and come up with this book? And it's a book that's really very user-friendly. It's really targeted to educators to really think, but also then enact. What inspired you? Maybe Ken and Dee, I'll let you kind of spar between yourselves.
I mean, I can go first since Dee pointed. I'm assuming you're pointing at me where I appear in your gallery. So
That's
first of
right.
all, everybody, I'm mindful of the time difference, so I will say good afternoon to you all. It's morning for me, and I'm glad that you all are here. And of course, John and Nancy, it's always a treat to see you both remotely. I'm still longing for the day where we can hang out in person, which we're going to have to make it happen. But to go to answer John's question, all of us are here for a reason, and obviously the whole idea around artificial intelligence is the conversation has accelerated and magnified in a very, very condensed period of time. And to share with everybody on the call, ultimately the nexus from idea to publication of the book is Dee and I It's one of the things, I'll put it to you all this way. So D and I, there is a number of things that he and I are almost like kindred spirits on, and that is we try to pride ourselves on being acute observers of things. And D and I have been around educational technology pretty much this whole century. And so as in November of 2022 was when AI became available, even though it was actually already existed long before that, but it's when large language models became available to the masses. And so then D and I were kind of taking an assessment of the educational landscape and noticing that the combination of the conversations were in only one of two areas, which ultimately created a binary approach to AI. It was either I'm all in, whereas D and I like to share, I'm going to throw up confetti and blow kazoos. I'm all in. It's going to be amazing. It's going to transform education. We're going to do all this cool stuff, and it's awesome. And then on the other side, you had, oh my God, it's dangerous. We got to block it. You can't touch it. Don't let the kids use it. Some of the common talking points, oh, they're going to cheat. What are we going to do? Oh my God, the sky is falling. The chicken just crossed the road. And so the whole idea around that was with D and I, we were like, yeah, now it's time for us to enter this chat, because the other thing is, and this is something for everyone on this call to feel free to do your own research on, is the other thing is that the folks that were talking about AI in education did not look like D and I at all. And so you had the binary perspective and plus a lack of depth with respect to representation of the conversation about artificial intelligence. So both D and I committed to each other that we would be diligent, but also methodical in putting together a book that ideally could resonate with educators, not limited to the geographical US.
Yep. And that is my common response to most of what Ken says. If I would add a little bit, I mean, number one, it should be known, Ken and I talk all the time. So it really started in our regular just conversations, phone calls, just talking back and forth, making these observations. And then I wanted Ken to go first because literally he was the one to push me to say, no, dude, we can't back out of this conversation. This matters a lot. We know it matters a lot, and we can't be silent, in particular, how it can affect marginalized students across the U.S. and beyond. And so I started heeding that, and then recognizing that the conversation, as Ken said, was very much binary. But when I first started kind of just sitting and waiting and seeing where it was all going to go, I started to recognize when the major corporations started getting involved, which was soon after, right? That uh, November 2022, and started seeing literally the billions being followed behind these large language models, starting with Microsoft and $10 billion invested. And then with OpenAI and then later, Claude coming out and seeing 2 billion from Google being invested, 4 billion from Amazon. Once these billions and these major corporations started getting engaged, and the main thing that Ken and I talked about was the recognition that these aren't just large tech companies. These aren't just companies that that control the Nasdaq. These are companies that control data. And so once we started paying closer attention to that, started thinking, this is much bigger than our kids cheating. This is what can be manipulated and negatively affect our entire society. And so it was worth diving into.
Thank you. And I think what's really important, Dee, you bring up is this idea of these big corporations and the big money. I don't know if people realize there are only 9 companies in the world that control AI. So all these education apps you're talking about, they are just tapping into one of those 9 companies. 5 of them are in the United States and 3 of them are in China. And all of their CEOs are men. So immediately, and also their check and balances are very different than governments and organizations like nonprofits or schools. Their check and balances is their shareholders. And what do shareholders want? They want dividends. They want money. So I think in that context, what's really interesting when we read your book is that you really kind of focus on this idea of equity and bias, the digital divide, ethics and privacy, personalized learning versus human oversight, and critical media literacy. And those are some pretty tall, meaty topics. Do you feel in the work that you're doing in your context and when you talk to schools, are we willing to engage with this at the depth and the kind of the focus that we need? And because I really feel that when I'm working with schools, a lot of the conversation is more about AI literacy, how to use a large language model, and some of the more, what I would say, mechanics. So tell us, what is the hesitancy of schools to really say, okay, we need to unpack this because this is super important, especially when you're considering you're working with the future generation of leaders around the world. So I'm going to let you guys point to each other,
Yeah.
and then it'll be easier that way. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll start out, and then Ken will definitely take it home, I'm sure. I agree. The schools aren't really wanting to have this conversation. You can even tell whenever we do enter the dialogue that we are pushing them to think much deeper and much more critically than they were considering. And the main reason why, and I think it has much more to do with than AI. It really is traditional, and that schools look at what can they understand and what can they control. And unfortunately, with those very simplistic perspectives, right, you're very limited when you're looking at something that is hard to understand, is rapidly evolving, that demands that you engage it in order to understand it, right? That you actually test many of your assumptions, not only with research, but literally with trying and applying. And then the control piece is something that has been, unfortunately, a part of our education system for too long. And so it has to do with, can we control who uses it, how they use it, what they use, all of those sort of things. And so when we come in and speak to even that as an issue of equity, and then we speak to the former part of the conversation from the lens of ethics, we realize that we're really pushing critical thinking on a different level. But that's necessary, and that's really what education is supposed to be for. And so the opportunity, there's many opportunities, but one of the major opportunities that we highlighted in the book with AI and its emergence is really to look at education as a whole much differently, much more critically, because it's demanded that we do so.
And Ken, you were saying, as Dee was sharing with us, is that this really plays into the whole issue of bias, which is something that you really highlight throughout the book. And you even mentioned, this idea of digital equity and media literacy. Talk a bit more about this bias, how it's almost, I think people don't realize how biased some of these well, all of them are biased. Why maybe are we not aware, or our filters not up? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so a couple of things to share with everybody here. So number one, when it comes to bias, I think I want to dispel one thing, and that bias is not always a negative. Okay, it's the way our brains work. It's how we sort and organize information. We label people, ideas, and things. But where it fits in with this, and really honestly, tech in general, the first one is a point that you just made. And I noticed Jeff put in the chat that there's now a European AI company, and I'm glad Jeff put that there, because I'm going to point something out with that connects back to what you just shared. But you figure, so you have a majority of AI companies or tech companies that have large AI platforms are geographically located in the US, and then the remainder are geographically located in China. Okay, so I'm going to share with everybody on here. I did this. So I gave a talk for a school system in Indonesia back in September. And I was talking about bias in AI. And I said, you can't avoid it, because there's a couple of things. Every single bit of tech that we use has had human hands and human thought behind it. And when you look at the first thing I had them do is I said, let's go and take a look at the C-level officers in many of the big tech companies. What do you see? What do you think? And what do you wonder? What pattern do you notice? Okay. And so then they did that. And I'm like, so what you see there is going to embed itself or end up in all of the platforms that we use. And I said, I'm going to prove one point. And so I encourage everybody on this call, or if someone's watching this recording, to do this. Go into a large language model. This is one of my favorite ones. I do several. One of my favorite ones. Say, go into a large language model and ask the large language model to explain the causes of the Civil War. Okay? I say that. Then they go do it. Take a guess what the bias is. And John, you already pointed at one thing. A majority of the companies are geographically located in the US. If you all type in what are the causes of the Civil War, what do you think the bias is going to be? I'm waiting to see if anyone puts it in the chat. I'll just tell you all, it's going to talk about the US Civil War. And I've even tried it out where I use a VPN on my computer and I connect to a server outside of the US and do the same thing. So that's one example. But here's where it can get to be even more, where we need to be more consciously aware of it. If I were to ask you all, if you were to go into an image generator and ask you to generate an image of a doctor, what do you immediately think of? And then I do all sorts of, I have a whole list. I do a doctor and 2 nurses. I do gifted student. I do CEO. I do computer scientist. I do hacker. I even do football player. Of course, keep that. There's one for you, football player. Okay. Remember how football in the US, we have soccer and American football, but everywhere else, football is what we commonly refer to as soccer. And so the whole point of me sharing that is that's part of why it's important to be able to have the conversations, be able to start to analytically interrogate really tech in general, but even AI systems. And I'm going to point to that in just a moment because, you know, think about it even in this context for everyone on the call. At what point did you realize you could change the skin tone on the emoji? See, and I can keep going on and on and on. And that's not, those are not happenstance designs. Those are intentional. Somebody made a decision to do that and somebody authorized them to do that. Now, when it comes to the AI component, you know, even with what Jeff shared in this, no AI company is going to start from scratch. And let me be clear on this one. And this goes into the ethics about AI. No AI company is going to build a platform from scratch. I don't care if it's for education or not. They will not build it from scratch. What they do is they get access to a large volume, but not the full, large volume of data sets, usually from either OpenAI or from Anthropic. And they take that, like if you imagine a 1,000-piece puzzle, through their API, they make like 400 of those pieces available for you. So then you take those 400 and now you have your source data set. And then now you start building from there. And so the whole idea around that is even if it's a company that is not geographically based in the US, they're going to get their initial source data from one of the existing AI companies, which means you're going to get some of the good, but you're also going to get some of the bad. And my whole thing that I think needs to happen in education is we got to go beyond the minutia conversation of, well, is it cheating? Was it plagiarism? Is it academic integrity? My approach is always, you got to go from a systems thinking understanding. How do these systems work? And what are the ways in which I can navigate? It's no different than when we learn, for example, how to drive a car. You don't necessarily have to know all the science behind how a car works, but you do know have to understand how a car as a system works to be able to appropriately navigate you know, driving on roads and things of that nature. And so when it comes to the AI conversation, I think it starts off with, how do the systems work? And if you understand how the system works, then you can begin the process of leveraging it in a meaningful and useful capacity. Otherwise, if we just go in and we just start doing it and we allow ourselves to continually be bogged down in the conversations as to whether it's cheating or whether it's not, all of the things that can permeate our experiences and influence the results are going to just continue to happen at a more accelerated capacity.
So I think what you're bringing up here is this idea that it should, you know, augment human roles, and the caution is let's avoid perpetuating these biased systems by not understanding how the systems work. So really having an in-depth understanding of those systems and understanding the context, I think, is so important. D.
And just to add, one of the statements I regularly make is that you cannot actually evaluate something external for bias if you're not willing to do the hard work to internally interrogate your own bias, right? And that's really the hard work. The hard work is considering, when Ken said what he said, of if you were to go to an LLM and you were to type in what would you expect to see, that expectation is internal. That expectation is a reflection of your own bias. And then the acknowledgement that your own internal bias and what you may consider could be collective bias that exists as a society. It's all a bunch of humans that are writing these data sets, right, that are then being built into the algorithms that are now being reflected in what the results are coming from the AI models. And so to first just acknowledge that, as Ken said, not all bias is bad. We all have bias, but then also to consider what are some of the negative biases that exist within us, and what are tendencies to always go back to, which is not necessarily, reflective of a positive, healthy environment or society. Those things exist in here, and you cannot, and I would dare even say you will not even attempt to look at the biases that exist external to you if you're not willing to take a mirror to yourself.
Thank you for that. And that is such important reflection. When we think of the current state where we are in a school and we have this technology that is newish, okay, couple years, and we know that AI has been around longer, but where it's really come into the uh, context of schools, it's interesting because this is technology where none of us got any professional development on it. We didn't learn about this as we became teachers or through teacher certification. I'm not sure what current teacher certification programs are doing regarding AI. And also, kids have come to this. So if we think of secondary students, they've come to this situation at the same time. So we're both kind of entering this at the same time with very different sets of toolkits and understandings how to engage with this. What have you noticed, and what do you think is important for educators to understand when you have such a dynamic where there is powerful new technology that's available anywhere? You don't actually need to go and buy it. Kids can use it at home. You can use it on your phone and pretty much anywhere. And schools can't be the gatekeepers of it. What does this mean now for that kind of power shift or control, as you talked earlier, in the school setting?
Rock, paper, scissors. Who wants to go on this one, kid? Hey, you stated it,
Yeah.
John. And it really is a power dynamic. I'll say something brief, and then I know Ken, of course, will elaborate and go further. Uh, the consideration, and this is just one of the things that we say, I believe, in chapter 1, and considering different contexts. You have school A that really aims to restrict AI tools, again, because they don't understand and feel like they can't control, and so they try and restrict it completely. And you're considering, at least in this particular case, the equity of access. But that's school A, and you consider with school A that restricts. Really, they've also set up there are consequences if a student is caught cheating. And in many ways, you also just think that's a honey trap, right? We know that students are then going to explore, investigate, and use, and in many cases misuse, not even necessarily intentionally, but because they don't even know how to effectively utilize these tools and are not getting the exposure or the training that is even necessary for them. So, right. So what we have in that case is a restrictive environment that is also going to up the discipline of a student who is caught cheating. And we know also historically, especially in the U.S., that disciplinary action is most commonly taken on and given to its fullest and most dramatic ends on students of color. You have a scenario B, which is where it is allowed to some level, limited, and that is typically, it looks like teachers are being given all kinds of tools to play with, all kinds of magical tools to play with and to learn and explore, really to create more busy work more expediently, to generate things that have never been proven to be effective, but to check it off the list that now I have a million worksheets and 2,300 lesson plans and whatever else created and generated. I have everything done for me. But students, again, you are disallowed. And if you are caught, there will be consequences. And then there's scenario C that really looks like an acknowledgement, right? An open acknowledgement that we don't know, understand all of these things. This is brand new, this is emergent, and it actually behooves us to learn in community how these things work and to begin to create some guidelines and guardrails as a collective. That collective, that teacher, administration, and student all actively engaging and learning, and then also creating some of the guidelines as a collective, really is a dispersion of power that does not normally is not what is normal in schools, right? Normally in schools, things are top down. There's a power structure that says we determine what you can and cannot do, and we levy consequences if you go against it. And it really is a lack of honesty, I think, that schools aren't acknowledging there is a lot that we don't understand, and we actually can learn and grow in our understanding if we do this together.
And I love that idea of the collective agency and tapping into this experience and the voice of students and the administration and the teachers, because kids are experiencing this very differently. I work with young kids, and I've done a survey. 60% of my primary school students have a voice assistant AI tool in their home that they interact with. And as one girl said, I love Alexa. She never argues, she's never upset, and she always says yes to me. What more do you want? So on that note, we would love you to go into a breakout room. And we've got quite a lot of meaty things that have been shared, and we're going to come back to. But what we'd like you to do in the breakout room is think about, what do you agree with what you've heard so far? What might you argue with? What might you aspire based on what you've learned and heard? And what are some assumptions maybe that you have, considering the context and the information? And if you have had the pleasure of reading this wonderful book, you could maybe weave that in some of your feelings and understandings from the book. And also it's helpful to think about your own context. Every person in this room is in a different geographic area, different type of school, different type of culture. Really make sure you bring that into your conversation. It's about you share what you agree, what you argue, what you aspire, and what assumptions you have. And I'm going to ask Dee and Ken, if you don't mind popping around the breakout rooms. I know people really appreciate just having you listen in. And that's a way also for you to get a sense of where people are. So have a wonderful conversation. Nancy is going to put you into these breakout rooms, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you all.
Everyone, the rooms are going to be opening up. And please remember, if you're able to put your camera on so everyone can see beautiful smiles and faces for tonight. So I'm going to open up the rooms. There are about 3 to 4 in a room to have a smaller conversation. And you have 11 minutes.
So we're going to ask you to do a little activity in the chat. Write a 6-word summary of what happened in your breakout room. Either talk about something that you agreed, something you argued, something you aspired, or something you assumed. And just when you're done, really it could be less than 6 words. It could be 1 word. And then just go ahead and share that. And we're going to get to see, yeah. So what are some of the 6-word shifts from rules? Agreement. Excellent. Oh, okay. AI is American. It's also Chinese. And Mistral, even though it likes to tout itself as a European company, the reality, both of its founders worked for Google for many years, DeepMind, and they're funded by Microsoft. So I think we just need to be mindful. If you start digging deeper in a lot of this, it's the same 5 companies that are behind everything.
Follow the money.
Yeah, follow the money. That's where it is, following the money. Excellent. Thank you. Students need to be involved. Thank you. That's so important. And we're so hesitant to do that sometimes. And I think it's so important. Partnership is key. Balance between regulation and education. Critical thinking matters more now. I applaud that. How to teach has changed. Fantastic. So, Ken, I do have a follow-up question, but I want to give you the space and time because we didn't cut you off, but you understood we had the breakout room. And if you want to just build on what Dee said, I would love to hear your perspective. And then what I thought is in your book, you talk about some actions, and I want to have a couple questions about actions, what teachers can do. So, Ken, just to wrap up the conversation that Dee shared so nicely with the different scenarios.
Yeah, so I think it'll connect to part of what we discussed in the breakout room. I'm going to kind of adjacent to what Dee shared. I think for all of us on this call, and this includes Dee and myself, because I do embrace the fact that nobody is an expert on this, that we can have varying degrees of experience and develop degrees of an expertise, but we're not an expert. But the reason why I say that is the first step to all of this is the fact that everybody's even on this call. Like that's the first step, okay? And we brought it up in the breakout room that I was in, and I shared that what I would encourage everybody here to recognize is that Dee's gonna laugh. Everybody's got a graph, and everybody's got some sort of infographic about how to use AI, and I will consciously say that Dee and I are probably one of the very few voices that are in opposition to that. And the reason why I say that is you cannot and should not oversimplify how we use artificial intelligence and distill it down to red light, don't use it. Yellow light, here's a way you can do it. Green light, go ahead. And I understand, let me be clear, I understand why people do that, but what I was sharing in our breakout room was we got to have the conversations and put things front and center. And so I'll share with everybody here a quick example. With many of the school districts and school systems I work with, one of my favorite things to do is work with focus groups with students. And so the first thing I've done with students is I put it all front and center. I don't say I'm going to tell you whether you can or cannot use it. I need you to be a critical consumer and user of technology and understand when is it appropriate for me to use it, when is it not, what are the ethical ways I can use it, and what are the things I need to be mindful of. And so I'll give you all an example. One of my favorite questions I pose to students is I ask them, are you okay with somebody speaking for you? And almost 100% of the time, the answer is no. Great, okay? Now I say, now I want you to we're going to go into an AI platform and we're going to have it write your paper for you. And then the next question I ask them is, okay, now I want you to read what it wrote. Does that sound like you? Do you write like that? And of course, almost always no. And I go, but is that something that you might be able to, a point of which you might be able to start from or to help you with your ideas? Yes. Okay. So now then we get into, if I'm not okay with someone speaking for me, then I'm also not okay with an AI speaking for me. And I also need to critically analyze what exactly is it putting out rather than me saying, I'm just going to have it do my paper for me. And I think that conversation needs to occur more readily within education, because if you really, really start to look at what many of these platforms put out, it's not, first of all, it's nothing new. Okay, let's be clear on that. AI systems cannot create something new. They only replicate patterns that have already existed. That's number one. Number two, when you get into the philosophical approach, it's really interesting when you start to pose the right questions to students. And this is where I always say, policies should be dynamic and they should not be a dictation of behaviors. And then the other thing that we discussed that I think is important for everyone on this call is the common selling points around something like AI. The number one selling point is the time savings. And I'm sure everyone on this call has heard, oh, AI will save you time. I don't even get into an argument about whether AI will save you time. What I do is with leaders and teachers that I always say, before we get into whether or not AI will save you time, let's look at what you're doing with the time you currently have. Because this whole idea around, oh, it'll save me time. Let me look at what am I doing with the time that I have. And I've done this with school leaders where I'm like, you know, that 1 hour meeting you had could have probably been captured into a 2-minute email. So now you've just regained 58 minutes. And by the way, you didn't need AI to do that. It's the whole idea around that self-awareness. And then the other common selling point is personalization. How we can personalize it to our learners. I encourage everyone on this call, whenever you hear that, I always follow up with a question. Okay, great. Tell me about one of your learners. And what usually happens, I go, well, I have a class like this. No, not the class. Pick one student from one of your classes and tell me about them. What's their backstory? What are their strengths? What are their assets they bring to the learning environment? What are the opportunities for growth? What are the things that they find of high value in the context of their learning? What is their response when you say, what does it mean for you to take ownership of your learning? Like, you can't personalize if you don't know the person. And that's the whole idea around, I am not opposed to AI by any stretch, but I don't think, I think we have to collectively reject the common marketing tactics around time savings, personalization, differentiation, when what that does is that strips us of the most important, I think, that exists in education, and that is the human interaction and the human element.
And that's just so important to bring that up because I think that's something we need to understand. You know, it's really what's happening is inorganic materials are starting to become more and more part of our life. And they're not human beings. These are machines. They don't have emotions. They don't have values themselves. Those are only supercharged by their misconceptions that we're hearing through what Dee and Ken are saying. One thing in your book that you really talk about is that the risks of automating ineffective practices, and that, you know, just because you use AI doesn't mean that your lesson is bad. If you give AI a bad lesson as an example, what is it going to do? It's going to create another bad lesson. And I think so often we think that AI is going to fix everything, but it also depends how we approach that. And what I love about the book is that you then talk about action points. And I would really like you now to spend a few minutes as we wrap up and then give the audience a chance to do a couple closing activities. Is what are some things, considering everything that we said, that you think are action points? We have school leaders, we have educators, we have people that are in administrative organizations. What are some of the must things that people can action today? Dee, do you want to start and then we'll go to Ken?
There's so many different places to go with that question. But what comes to mind is the conversation I was having with Simon in Breakout, and that is to explore different AI tools and to learn some of the nuances in how they work. Because unfortunately, I believe because ChatGPT was first on the scene, then many folks in general, as well as educators, think ChatGPT is AI, right? And that is the only place in which they're willing to explore and to consider that there are other tools that exist and to engage them and learn some of the nuances and how they work. Also recognizing that, because again, we were talking about these big conglomerate companies that are, aiming to profit off of you, right? Like oftentimes if a school is already heavily invested in a particular ecosystem, so if I utilize Google Workspace and Gemini is then built in, right now, all of a sudden I'm sort of tunnel vision, and now that's all I'm diving into, right? And then of course we talk about bias, which also can manifest itself in just preferences in your own personal practice. It's like, oh, I discovered Claude, and so that's all I go to. That's all I go to and learn from and kind of utilize. I would say that as you recognize that these different companies and these different tools that are representative of these different companies are aiming for your allegiance, right? That's what they're aiming for, is your exclusive allegiance. I would say resist that and make it part of your repertoire to learn multiple tools, multiple large language models. We didn't even get into image generation tools as well, and really aim to explore how they work, which ones tend to be more effective for different purposes. So very simplistic, personal, analysis. I like to say, I will go to a chat GPT or a Copilot in order to give me results. And I'll go to a Copilot in particular if I want to also get links that I can explore for further research, but tends to be very exhaustive, but also not very humanistic in its speech. And I may go to a Claude, especially if I want to give it information to ingest and then to analyze and then to synthesize and give summary points, right? Like that's one of the things that I've learned from exploring and learning. And then I go to Gemini, especially when I want something to be stylized, right? I may take a result from one and then say to a Gemini, proofread this. And then even knowing that it's not only going to give me a result, but it's also going to give me, it's going to state what changes it made and why. So I'm going to learn from that, and it'll give me a few different drafts. Well, all of that learning came from me exploring, and that's just three of several other tools that do exist out there. So an action point I would say is like build your repertoire and explore and learn, and do that, of course, in community, because that's when you learn the most, is when you ask from others, what did you learn? What did you learn? What did you learn? And then you really are gaining skills from there as well.
Dee, it's so interesting because most schools work with an inquiry focus. If you think of the IB, the MYP, the PYP, and even in other curriculums, it's about being an inquirer, exploring, being a critical thinker, thinking about thinking. And those things are so important. The way you're describing it, you're just really giving us an anecdote of an inquirer engaging with large language models and being very purposeful in their inquiry and understanding that there's some advantages and disadvantages. Ken, over to you. Thank you, Dee.
Yeah, I've been putting some stuff in the chat. I love some of the other comments. I think with piggybacking on what Dee shared and just kind of going forward for everybody on this call. So number one, what Dee just pointed out is exactly why I always start off with, you've got to have a systems thinking approach first. Artificial intelligence, for everyone on call, has been around since about the mid-50s. And this is why, to be honest with you, I laugh when I hear things, we're going to block AI. And I just say, okay, so that means you're going to block spell check too then, right? Because that's a type of artificial intelligence, okay? And so, and I know that's why it's important to understand the systems. The large language models, they may operate similarly, but they are different. For you all, here's another activity to consider. And by the way, Dee and I did publish companion guide for our book that I love it, because that's where you, and he's holding it up, that's where you say, okay, I read your book and I understand your concept. Now I want to put them to tangible action. That's why we did the companion guide. And it was also because we know a lot of folks were going to do book studies. And as much as Dee and I want to be in the room for the book study, we know we couldn't. But I share this with you all because I'll give you all an example. Take a simple prompt and put it in one large language model, copy and paste that exact same prompt and put it into a couple of more, and watch how the results are different. Even though they all have massive data sets and ultimately some of the algorithmic structure is the same, they are different. Same thing with image generators. Put a prompt in one and then put in the other. This is why it's important to have a systems thinking approach. And this is why I think it's important to really embrace using it responsibly and ethically with our learners, because it's no different than, here's one for you all. I'll try to be quick with this. You all remember a lot of the arguments about not letting students use Google back in the day? You all remember, don't let the kids use Google because what? They're going to Google the answers. And remember, a lot of us in education were like, well, then maybe we should be asking different questions. And then the other component to that, even just like within AI, was when you ask students, when you do a Google search, do you automatically just click on the first link? as opposed to looking at the links and determining which one is going to likely take me to the information that's most needed, most useful, most credible. But you see, that you got to understand how Google search works to understand how it prioritizes those links. It's not based on what's most credible, most useful, and what's been vetted. It's based on what's been clicked on the most and linked to the most. And so that's the whole idea around these AI systems, is to recognize that which system best fits the needs that I have. And that's why I put it in the chat as well. And even put it, and paid for as well. Do a Google search. You'll know that first link. Usually there's a little disclaimer off to the right that's small enough that you might miss it. And it says advertisement, because Google is an ad company. Okay. That's what they are, first and foremost. But that also leads back to my final thing to share with everybody here is when you're engaging in the conversation around artificial intelligence, and I think it's essential, what is the problem that you are trying to solve that the humans can't solve or don't have the resources to solve, and thus AI now becomes a part of that solution? It's fascinating to watch when I hear, oh, we're going to use AI. What problem are you trying to solve then? And help me understand how you can't do it, and you need AI to do it for you. And just that question really catalyzes thinking around, oh, okay. And it's one of those things when if you understand how the systems work and where there's a gap in, I have a problem and I need AI to help me do the solution, I'm going to select the AI platform that's going to best serve those needs. And again, it's not going to replace or supplant me or what I'm doing. It augments what I'm doing. It's no different than, when you cook. I know how to cook, but I sometimes will use a measuring cup. That augments what I'm doing because I can't visually see a certain amount of something. I need a measuring cup to help me, but it doesn't change the fact that I still understand ingredients and I still understand the cooking process.
And that's so important, is that I think as you are speaking and sharing, that is the importance, not to it replace us, but to enhance what we do. And really understanding when is that enhancement needed and when is it not, and maybe you can enhance it yourself. I'm very mindful of time, and one thing that we're going to ask you to do is in the chat, you're going to write something, but you're not going to hit the enter button or return. Write down your commitment that you're going to make to yourself, to your community, to your students, based on what you heard today. What is your commitment to your community, your colleagues, yourself, your students, focused on the wonderful sharing and knowledge and wisdom that Dee and Ken have been sharing us from the book, The Promise and Perils of AI in Education. Please don't hit the return button yet, okay? We're going to do what Nancy calls the waterfall. So when you have written your commitment, just put your thumbs up for those that have a camera, and we'll go with the majority on that. Okay. And Nancy, would you like to do the call?
All right, on the count of three, everybody. 1, 2, 3, press return. Let's see your commitments, because you were here for an hour and these are your takeaways. And we thank you. So John, want to just say goodbye to everybody?
Yes, so first of all, Ken and Dee, maybe we could just have one very, very short parting thought for our audience as they move on. There's the companion, so that's something always nice if you're doing a book group, having the companion to really dig into this. And I love this book. I use it, I don't know how many times. It reframed my understanding in the sense that I now make ethics the first thing. Ethics is the first thing. So Dee and Ken, a short little parting thought, and then we're going to do our traditional goodbye from the left. So Ken and Dee, over to you. Something short and succinct.
For me, I'll just say, keep the conversation going. Obviously, I'm self-advocacy is I believe one of the most important forms of self-care. Please, if you haven't, consider acquiring a copy of our book. Get the companion guide. I put in the chat. Feel free to reach out. I do encourage you all, if you know, whether it's within your school or a series of schools, is to do a book study. We do encourage learning in community, and both Dee and I are accessible on the socials. And you know, I know that we do travel a lot to give talks. In fact, Dee and I, for you where you all are, it won't work, but Dee and I are both keynoting a conference in Hong Kong this next February on this very topic. But most importantly, please stay in touch. Do not go it alone, because I think learning in community is the most powerful thing that we can do to raise our collective voices on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Ken, for those thoughts. And Dee.
I would just say reject simplicity. Whenever you see or hear something like, hey, just use this prompt in order to produce these results, dig deeper. Add this bot in order to do this for you, dig deeper. If you hear a presenter say something like at the end of their statement, and you want to make sure that you check for the bias, and then everyone applauds and they start to move on, raise your hand and ask, what does that mean? How can I do that? Reject simplicity.
Thank you so much, Dee, for those parting thoughts. To everybody in the room, thank you so much for being part of this after a long day, and, you know, sharing your wisdom and thoughts and questions and being in the rooms and really collaborating together. I want to thank Ken and Dee again for being here. And of course, ECIS and Nancy, that the loft is just such, it's like the home away from home. So
Yes.
Nancy, thank you for having me the privilege of spending some time with Dee and Ken. And yes, we need to physically see each other sooner than later. On that note,